Madam Chair, I thank members for the many comments and questions. This is the Ministry's first COS, and I'm glad that there's so much interest in the work that we do. Beyond the discussion in this House, there have also been many Singaporeans talking about similar issues in our dialogues, in our feedback sessions, and in the Singapore conversation. And it's because as a people we are searching for deeper meaning and fulfillment beyond material success. We want Singapore to be more than just a vibrant city. We want Singapore to be a home. As one of the participants in the Singapore conversation put it, and I quote, "I have a dream that we will be a nation as opposed to an economic outpost, where our children feel they belong to this country and have faith and hope in the future." This search for meaning is not unique to Singapore and Singaporeans. Around the world, people are asking similar questions, because with globalization, with the fast pace of modern living, questions on identity and belonging are becoming more complex for people everywhere. And this is the reason why MCCY was formed. Our aim is to build a shared culture and an engaged community. And unlike the 5 C's that we are familiar with, these 2 C's are not so easy to measure. I think a point which Mr. Baey Yam Keng mentioned yesterday. But culture and community are important. They are essential elements of what makes Singapore home for all of us. So we will do whatever we can to strengthen our cultural core and our community bonds. Let me start with culture first. Over the years, our cultural scene has become more vibrant. I think many members mentioned that as well. We have more local movies. You would have seen, I hope many of you would have seen Jack Neo's Our Boys to Men. It's quintessentially Singaporean. There are many local music bands, and we have a year-round selection of festivals, sports events, fairs, and lifestyle activities to choose from. More importantly, we have created a Singaporean culture and identity. It may be difficult to express in words what Singaporean culture is about, but it's in our shared attitudes, memories, experiences, and values. It's in our food and our lifestyle. And it's certainly in the way we work, the way we talk, the way we celebrate, and the way we cheer for Team Singapore together. And the test is whenever we are overseas, it's always easy to pick out a fellow Singaporean, even from afar. But we are a young nation, and as several members have highlighted, the fast pace of development and the rapid changes in our society make it difficult to develop strong cultural anchors for our national identity. Thank you. So it's easy to feel disoriented, especially with the increase in population and new immigrants in recent years. All this means that we must do more now to step up our cultural development. Many members highlighted this in their speeches. Ms. Janice Koh in particular spoke about this just now and also earlier in the budget debate. And I agree with all of your views. Cultural vitality is very much a part of sustainable development. In the concept of sustainable development, the experts talk about the 3 pillars of development. There's economic, social, and environment. But there's also a need for a 4th pillar, and that's in the area of culture. And when I talk about culture, I'm referring to it in the broadest sense of the word. Singapore culture is shaped not just by the established canon of art forms like drama, painting, or literature. Please don't misunderstand. These are important and we will give these our fullest support. But culture is also about how we express and understand ourselves, whether it's singing or dancing or participating in sports or spending time with family and friends. Ultimately, culture is about the expression of the human spirit. It is about bringing people together across divides, and it is about strengthening Singapore's appeal to us as a home. Our first Culture Minister, Mr. Rajaratnam, laid the foundations for this important work. And when he started out in the ministry, the first Culture Ministry, he envisioned a shared culture for our people, one which is rich and diverse, rooted in many civilizations, as he put it, and yet distinctively Singaporean. That's what we are trying to achieve in MCCY, through the arts, heritage, sports, and through youth engagement. But we cannot do it alone, because it requires a whole of government effort. And that's because culture cuts across many other areas, whether it's education, manpower, or national development. At the same time, cultural development cannot be led by the government alone. It's really a whole of society partnership. because the culture of our nation is defined by how we relate to one another. So in the past few months since MCCY was formed, I've initiated many dialogues on culture, including through the Singapore Conversation. This is very much work in progress, and we will continue to have more sessions and to involve Singaporeans in shaping our cultural plans. Even as we continue this public engagement, there are some areas which we have studied, and based on the feedback received, we are ready to move forward. So I will share some of these plans today, and I'll touch on developing the arts and heritage in this speech, and about sports and youth later. And Madam Chair, with your permission, I'll have some slides to show on the LED screen.
Yes, please.
So on arts and heritage, what are our plans? First, we will engage Singaporeans in preserving and remembering our past. To nourish the Singapore soul, we must embrace the past and celebrate our heritage. One way to do so is through major national events, to remember the good times as well as the hard times that we've been through as a people. And that's why we are doing something to commemorate the 10th anniversary of fighting and containing the SARS outbreak, as Minister Gan mentioned in the MOHCOS. But besides these national stories, we must also make the Singapore story one that is personally meaningful to every Singaporean. And for many of us, our memories of Singapore are more localized. They are linked to the familiar things that we grew up with. Our HDB estates, our schools, something that Mr. Bay spoke passionately about at the MOECOS, our community parks and gardens, our favorite food store in the hawker center, or the old mama stores in the HDB void decks. As Mr. Sito Yipin said very eloquently just now, heritage is not something that's detached, it's part of our everyday lives. Singapore may be a small country, but there are special characteristics in the different parts of our little island that reflect our unique history and identity. And several members like Dr. Chia Shi Lu and Mr. Alex Siam spoke about this, and I fully agree with them. So let me give you some examples. I grew up in the East, in Marine Parade, and I tried long and hard to find an old photo that would show Marine Parade when I was growing up in the 70s. I managed to find one in the archives. One of the point blocks is where I used to stay. And I remember going to East Coast Park in weekends. It's not as green as it is now because the trees were newly planted and you can't see a lot of greenery at that time. But I remember going to East Coast Park, the beach every weekend. I remember the schools that we went to in the neighborhood, not in Marine Parade because it was a new town and there weren't schools there, but we went to schools further out like in Head Road and Tanjong Katong, and the famous Katong Laksa and chicken rice in East Coast Road. So that's my memory growing up. In the central part of Singapore, you have Queenstown, which Dr. Chia Shi Lu spoke about. It's our first satellite estate named in commemoration of Queen Elizabeth's coronation. This is where we had the Tachong Emporium, the 3 cinemas at the town center. They were the hip places to hang out in the 60s and 70s. And today you can still see some of the old buildings there, like Princess House, which was where HDB's first office was located, and the old wet market. And Queenstown is well loved by the community, so much so that there's a civic group, My Community, which came up with 5 heritage trails of the area on their own. In the west, in Jurong, we have other historical markers. This was where we started Jurong Industrial Estate more than 4 decades ago. This is a Vespa. We had a Vespa company producing Vespa in Singapore then. We had the first built-up hawker centers in Singapore. And we also had our first drive-in cinema where many Singaporeans had their first date. And as you can see from these pictures, and you can see from these pictures, there are many other exhibits. The next one, there are many other exhibits about Jurong, which we brought together at the Taman Jurong Community Museum. This is our first community museum, which was opened earlier this year, and it had very strong response from the citizens and residents in the community. I've shared examples in the East, Central and Western regions, but in fact every part of Singapore is unique with its own flavor. And we want to foster a sense of pride in the community for the distinctive heritage that we have in these different parts of our nation. To achieve this, we have to strike a balance between preservation and development. Our old buildings, structures and sites are part of our built heritage. They help preserve memories and contribute to the unique character of our living environment. So NHB will work closely with HDB, URA and other agencies to consider heritage elements in our development planning process. We want to make Singapore a modern city with deep roots. We will also expand our heritage-related activities and projects to strengthen our Singaporean identity and way of life. And I agree with Mr. Alex Yam that we should celebrate the masters of our vanishing trades. This is why NHB has been working hard to document and highlight the things that we all cherish as part of our heritage, like our traditional bakeries, or this picture here which shows, the next one, a street barber at Aliwal Street. And you can see several students gathering around the barber. They are trying to record what he's doing to preserve the memories and keep them for future generations of Singaporeans. To give Singaporeans a greater sense of ownership over our heritage, MCCY and NHB will develop more community-based museums, heritage galleries and trails in neighborhoods all over Singapore. So far, we have 10 heritage trails, from heritage trails marking historical sites of national importance in the civic district and along the Singapore River, to sites that showcase our community memories in neighborhoods like Balestier, Queenstown and Yishun, Sembawang. And you can see the map of the completed heritage trails. This year, NHB will launch 3 more heritage trails in Toa Payoh, Tampines and Tiong Bahru, and there will be more to come after that. Our longer-term plan is to develop an island-wide network of community museums, galleries and heritage trails. And in developing all of these plans, our approach is to partner the community to celebrate our heritage together. We want to encourage more ground-up heritage initiatives, and we will engage students, volunteers and heritage interest groups and facilitate self-initiated heritage efforts. NHB will also widen and deepen its engagement with heritage enthusiasts, including bloggers, people in our educational institutions and non-profit organizations like the Singapore Heritage Society and the Organization for Senior Volunteers, RSVP. It will also nurture heritage champions, equip them with the necessary training to become lifelong advocates, and provide them with assistance to develop self-initiated projects. And through all of these channels, we want Singaporeans to have the opportunity to move beyond being passive audiences of heritage content to being active creators and participants. Together, we can celebrate the unique aspects of each community's heritage and make the Singapore story come alive as seen and told by Singaporeans. So that's our first strategy around heritage and the past. Second, we will also enhance our national museums and make them more accessible. Even as we develop our heritage at the community level, I agree with Mr. Sito Ipin and other members that we cannot neglect our national museums because they are the key repositories of our nation's memories and history. Through our museums, we celebrate the story of Singapore and Singaporeans and provide a link to history for us and our children. Through our museums, we also see Singapore's development in relation to other civilizations and broader world events. Take, for example, the picture that's coming up on screen, this collection of shipwrecked treasures from the Tang Dynasty, salvaged off the Java Sea. It shows how Singapore has long been at the crossroads of maritime trade between China, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. The exquisite gold cup that you see at the top of the picture was probably a diplomatic gift made in China on its way to the Persian courts. How do we know this? Well, first of all, the octagonal shape of the cup is clearly not Chinese. And secondly, there are figurines on the cup which are Middle Eastern. So Singapore was at the center of international trade even back in the first millennium. But the significance of our central location will be most keenly felt only 1,000 years later, in the 19th century, when Malaya became a chessboard for European powers vying for supremacy through their colonies. The British were then searching for a new port south of Penang, and they dispatched their ships, Discovery and Investigator, to look for a suitable harbor. And this old monochrome painting was done by a midshipman on one of the ships, Discovery, way back in 1819, the year of Singapore's founding. It says, you may not be able to make it out, but there's a small sort of a few words at the bottom of the painting that says it's a painting from Rocky Point. Rocky Point is around the current Fullerton area, the Fullerton Hotel area. So the painter was there looking across the Singapore River, and you can see some high points or high features in the background. That's probably Fort Canning, where he was looking out to. So this painting is one of the earliest surviving depictions of Singapore and provides an eyewitness account of a pivotal moment in our history. And there are many, many more wonderful items like this in our national collection, in our museums, that tell the story of how Singapore has evolved as a nation. We want to enhance this content in our national museums so that they can better tell the Singapore story in a way that resonates with Singaporeans. So over the next 5 years, we will invest $62 million to help our museums build up their collections and conserve these collections with new techniques. We will increase access to our collection through our museums and also online so that our artifacts and artworks can be enjoyed by both present generation and kept safe for future generations. But our museums are not just about objects and exhibitions. They are really about our people. And we want our museums to be central to the cultural and community life of all Singaporeans, enjoyed by young and old alike. And here I acknowledge that there is scope to improve. Our surveys show that although 3 in 4 Singaporeans agree that participating in heritage activities and visiting in museums are important in developing a sense of belonging, only 1 in 5 Singaporeans actually visited our museums and heritage institutions. So there's a bit of a disjoint. 75% say it's important, but only 20% actually visit. Some have suggested year-round free entry to our museums. Mr. Baey Yam Keng raised this idea in 2011. And Ms. Janice Koh also asked this in the PQ last year. I have discussed this with our museum team. Over the years, we have progressively expanded the scope of free admissions. For example, we now have free entry in the month of August. But we've stopped short of doing it year-round. And the key consideration was to ensure sustainability over the long term. This remains a concern. And so from time to time, when we bring in special exhibitions with external partners, there will be entry charges to help cover the costs. In fact, this is done in museums all over the world. But aside from these periodic special shows, I'm convinced that there are significant merits to opening up our museums for all Singaporeans to enjoy. Take the example of Ms. Teh Biluan. She has 2 children and she wrote to NHB last year to tell us how much she appreciated the free museum entry in August. She doesn't have a high household income, so costs are a concern. But she made full use of the free entry in August and brought her children to the national museums every weekend. She could not complete all the museums last August, and I know they are looking forward to the next time that they can go to the museum. And I think there are many others like them who will benefit from greater access to our museums. So after careful consideration, I have decided to make entry to our national museums and heritage institutions free for Singaporeans and permanent residents all year round. We will start from 18th of May with the launch of this year's Children's Season in the Museum. I think it's a fitting day to start free museum entry because 18 May also happens to be International Museum Day. I hope this move will encourage more Singaporeans to visit our museums and heritage institutions. There's a lot you can see, learn, and enjoy, especially for people with families and children. More importantly, I hope that Singaporeans take pride in our museums. At the same time, we will make sure that our museums step up their outreach and programs to the community so that more Singaporeans can come to our museums to appreciate and enjoy our diverse culture and heritage. The third strategy we have is to continue with efforts to engage our communities through the arts. Mr. Arthur Feng, several members mentioned about this, and I think Ms. Janice Koh also made a point about how arts programs should be kept affordable, especially for low-income families. And that's what we are trying to do with our community outreach. And there are many activities we have started which are accessible to all. For example, we have provided learning opportunities to appreciate the arts through the Arts and Culture 101 programs in our libraries. We have brought the arts closer to our people through community clubs, libraries, and parks. An important part of what we are trying to do is to promote ground-up initiatives, whether in singing, dancing, acting, or playing a musical instrument. And since we rolled out the Community Engagement Master Plan last year, almost 250 new community interest groups across various art forms like pottery, theatre, singing, and ukulele have been formed. Recently, we had the Passion Arts Singing Festival, and as you can see in the picture, very good turnout, lots of participation, more than 35,000 people taking part. And around the island, we have 140 Passion Arts hotspots, like the one shown here, where residents have a chance to showcase their artistic talents every month. The spirit of ground-up initiatives is captured by this group of young Singaporeans. They wanted to show the importance of valuing the contributions of our foreign workers. So they made friends with a group of Bangladeshi workers and even went to visit their families in Bangladesh. And with support from NAC and the Singapore International Foundation, these young people presented the personal stories of our foreign workers through a photography exhibition and a short film screening at the Arts House. Later, they even formed a music band with some of these workers. They learned about their music and they put up a performance that combined their music with rock, pop, and indie sounds. I think it's a wonderful example of what we can do to build bridges across communities through the arts. Some members, Ms. Irene Ng, Ms. Janice Koh, have suggested that the best way to engage a community is to draw on the expertise of artists and art organizations. And I agree fully with them. Community art is something that we want not just for the numbers, but for deep engagement and to help transform lives. And I think our artists are in a very good position to do this. Today, many of the NAC's grant recipients, like the Necessary Stage and Drama Box, actively engage the community through quality programs. And going forward, NAC will do more to work with art practitioners who are keen to engage the community and co-create arts projects with them. Ms. Tay B.A. is one such example. With support from NAC, she worked with the Asian Women's Welfare Association Seniors Activity Center to organize a craft project for seniors, where she taught them to incorporate creative elements into patchwork. When she first started the workshop, the seniors were worried about making mistakes, so the most common excuse was, "I cannot draw." And the second most common excuse was, "Just tell me what to do and I'll do it." But DA insisted that they come up with their own creative expressions. So she asked them to start with something simple, to cut out simple pictures showing stories of their past and stitch them into craft work. And the result was colorful, everyday scenes, the places they used to work at, the homes they used to live in, birds, flowers, even an image of the trams that used to run along Singapore. And as you can see from this picture, the seniors were proud to showcase their handicraft, as they had achieved something which they never thought they could do in the past. These are all examples of how the arts can develop self-confidence, promote creative expressions, and transform lives. And there's still much more we can do. The key to do this well is good implementation on the ground. And I recognize that we can do better, but we are committed to doing this well, and we will take in feedback and suggestions from members on how we can improve our engagement on the ground. If there are suggestions on things that we can do better, we will study them, and we will step up our community engagement efforts in the coming years. Fourthly, we will also reach out to young people, to our children, and strengthen arts education in schools. Last year, we had the Arts and Culture Education Master Plan, where teachers were given more access to training in teaching the arts, and students were given more support to put up performances and pursue artistic projects. Through these efforts, we want to make sure that every child in school can regularly take part in different cultural activities and learn to express themselves through storytelling, arts and crafts, singing, music making, and dance. We also want them to have the opportunity to appreciate artistic excellence and be inspired through visits to the museum, theatre, concert hall, or heritage sites. One of the initiatives under the master plan is a new Arts and Culture Presentation Grant for schools, which MCCY and MOE launched late last year. The grant hopes to create more opportunities for youths to have a deeper engagement with arts and culture and to share their artworks beyond the school community, especially in public places. We have awarded the grant to 37 schools, and we have made a special effort to support schools that may not have had the resources to showcase their student performances and artworks to the public. And the proposals that were submitted and that we have seen are all very promising. Like this picture of Serangoon Junior College students putting up a series of monologue skits and plays with the scripts mostly written by students themselves. Or ITE College Central, the students are using the grant to do something interesting, using infrared photography to create images. I asked them what infrared photography was about, and they gave me a technical explanation which I couldn't understand. But I think it's best to demonstrate it by showing you a picture of what an infrared photograph looks like. And that's what the students are trying to do. And I think there are many other examples of young people participating in the arts through these efforts that we are doing, and we will continue to do so and give maximum exposure in the arts to our students. Fifth, the government will continue to support our local artists and help them in their pursuit of artistic excellence. There were many members who spoke about this, like Ms. Irene Ng, Ms. Janice Koh, Mr. Arthur Fong, and I share their views that we must continue to support our local artists in the pursuit of excellence. We must recognize our local artists who have dedicated their lives to excelling in their craft. And there are many of them whom we can be proud of, like Mr. Kwek Swee Boon, the founder of his own dance company, the Human Expression Dance Company, THE. He did this together with his wife and a small team of dancers. It was very difficult at first, but in 3 years, THE is now touring cities like Paris, Dubai, and they have built up a reputation for themselves as a contemporary dance company combining Western and Eastern forms of dance. Without our artists, we would not have the quality of artwork and performances that ignite our imagination, stir our spirits, and inspire our creativity. There are some perceptions that state funding for artistic excellence has been compromised somewhat because of funding for community engagement in the arts. And I would like to clarify that, in fact, the government support for artists and art groups has actually increased significantly over the years. NAC's direct assistance to our artists and art groups, such as through grants, arts housing rental subsidies, scholarship and training, has almost doubled over the past 5 years. And in this year's budget, state funding for the arts will increase by a further significant amount. And I should say that we are in a fortunate position to do so. As Culture Minister, I'll be the first to stand up to beat the drum for more funding for culture. But I think we should be glad that we are having more state funding. And because when I talk to my other counterparts in other countries, they are quite envious of our position. Around the world, you see governments tightening their belts, and funding for the arts is often the first to be cut. In Singapore, I'm glad that we have the Exchequer that is supportive of the arts and has agreed to increase our art funding, as well as sports funding, but that's a separate topic which I'll talk about later. Over the past year, NAC has done extensive consultations with artists and art groups on how the government can provide better support for them. And based on this feedback, NAC has recently improved its grant schemes. I won't go into the details because it's already made public, but there are some directional shifts which I would like to explain. First, we will offer more integrated support throughout the entire art-making process, from creation to production to market and audience development. I think those were points that some members mentioned. So we are not just looking at specific parts, but the entire spectrum of art-making, we will provide funding. Second, we will have more funding provisions to help our artists achieve excellence, to encourage new creative and innovative content and build capabilities. Again, these are areas which members have highlighted, and the new grants framework is indeed aligned in this direction. For example, we have enhanced the grants to support original and innovative content, and we have introduced new grants to support productions in both local and international markets, as well as to build audiences at home and abroad. Third, we have a longer funding tenure to give grant recipients greater financial stability and the ability to plan for long-term projects. For example, under the revised organization-based major grant scheme, the funding tenure has now been extended to 3 years. Ms. Janice Koh voiced concerns about the possibility of some art groups graduating from the major grant scheme after 3 years. And I would like to assure her that NAC will continue to support companies that play a key role in our art scene. It may or may not be through the major grant scheme, but there are other grant schemes which we can tap on and which now include higher and more comprehensive levels of support. And then finally, we are also going to be more inclusive in supporting a more diverse range of art forms as well as applicants. In particular, commercial arts companies and intermediaries such as galleries, presenters, producers and publishers will be eligible for almost all project grants in recognition of the role they play in a vibrant arts and culture ecosystem. These revisions in NAC's grant schemes will raise funding to our artists and art groups to around 94 million between financial year 2012 and 2016. And it is a significant increase of almost 140% compared against the previous 5-year period from 2007 to 2011. And with this additional investment, our artists will have greater support to pursue their passion and to hone their craft. I should perhaps say a few words about funding guidelines, which Ms. Janice Koh talked about earlier as well. Our guidelines are there really because of the need for accountability in the use of public funds. And NAC will apply these with a light touch and provide space as much as possible for our artists and art groups to express themselves creatively. I think the key does not lie in funding guidelines per se, but the key lies in building a discerning audience that is supportive of artistic expression, even if it may be sometimes provocative or controversial. And that requires deep dialogue and engagement between our artists and the broader community, different diverse groups which MCCY and NAC will facilitate so that we can gradually open up the space for more artistic expressions. Complementing our support through the grants framework are national platforms like the Singapore Arts Festival, the Singapore Biennale, Singapore Writers Festival. And these platforms also support our artists and art groups by commissioning local works. And through these platforms, our artists will have the chance to profile their works both locally and abroad. Besides the NAC grants, we also have arts housing subsidies. The number of artists and art groups who benefited from subsidized studios has increased to more than 170 in 2013 over the past 5 years. This is an increase of almost 90%. And in addition, the artists and arts groups benefit from the project studios and the pay-per-use rehearsal and performance spaces in these arts housing facilities. While it's not possible to house all our artists and arts groups in subsidized spaces, NAC will continue to develop alternative options by working with partners such as commercial developers and community centers to co-locate artists and art groups in their facilities. I will also now briefly highlight our plans to promote artistic excellence in 3 different sectors. The first is the performing arts sector, and that's something that Ms. Janice Koh mentioned. The pinnacle performing arts festival is the Singapore Arts Festival. And as members are aware, a review committee was set up last year, and it submitted its recommendations for the festival to have a sharper focus on artistic quality to inspire audiences. The review committee also called for the festival to be run by an independent festival company. My ministry has reviewed the recommendations, and we agree with the broad direction set out by the committee. So NAC will set up a new company to take over the running of the Arts Festival, which will return in 2014. And this is one example where we are happy to step back and give the arts community greater latitude in creative expressions. And the company will be given the autonomy to determine the festival's artistic direction, and this will allow the arts community to expand its programming capabilities and over time enable the festival to develop a stronger identity of its own. On theatre space, which is something Ms. Janice Koh talked about, I think it's an issue of both cost and space. On costs and charges, it's something we are prepared to review, and we do so from time to time, but I would say that we already charge local arts groups subsidized rates, despite running these theatre spaces at a loss. On space provisions, I think we will do more so that we can have more options for our art groups. And when the refurbishment of Victoria Theatre and Victoria Concert Hall is completed and reopens in mid-2014, these two venues will provide much needed, professionally fitted out and managed mid-sized venues in the city, in addition to the current drama centre. We are also looking at ways to promote excellence in the visual arts sector. We already have a growing calendar of exciting visual arts events, like the Singapore Art Week, which was held earlier this year. And we had many people come to see the art exhibitions. And there's also growing interest in Singapore art, whether it's works by our pioneering artists like Liu Kang, Chen Wen-si, Chong Su-ping, or Georgette Chen, or by our current leading arts practitioners like Iskandar Jalil, Ming Wong, Thomas Yeo, Tan Swee Hien. And to build up our visual arts sector further, we will do more to strengthen our art professionals' capabilities in areas such as critical research, writing, and curatorship. The visual arts sector will also receive a further boost when the National Art Gallery opens in 2015. And together with the Singapore Art Museum and the Singapore Tyler Print Museum Institute, we will have 3 visual arts institutions under MCCY. I think there will be benefits to strengthening this visual arts cluster of comprising these 3 institutions to achieve better coordination, to deepen our capabilities, to boost scholarship, and to maximize synergies. So that's something that we are looking at to form and to develop this visual arts cluster. And we are also looking at international platforms for the visual arts. One of the most important contemporary visual arts show in the world is the Venice Biennale. NAC had earlier announced a hiatus from the Biennale this year. We have reviewed this and decided that our participation in the Venice Biennale is important in profiling our artists internationally. And I'm happy to say that plans are currently underway in consultation with the relevant agencies and stakeholders to pave our return to the next Venice Biennale in 2015. The third area is the traditional arts sector. The traditional arts, such as Chinese ink painting, bangsawan, Malay opera, and Indian dance, these are an important part of our culture and heritage. They provide a link to our past and to our ancestral roots. And at the same time, because the traditional arts in Singapore have evolved with a certain local flavor and character, they also contribute to our distinctive Singapore culture. So we will continue to support and promote the traditional arts in Singapore. And Madam Chair, allow me to say a few words on this in Mandarin. 主席，
Madam Sir, the government has all along been supporting the preservation and promotion of our traditional arts to enhance Singapore's multicultural flavor. By influencing one another, our traditional art forms can evolve into a unique blend that is our distinctive cultural resource. In this manner, we will become a true nexus of a cultural exchange between East and West. Over the years, through our arts practitioners' painstaking efforts and with the support of the government, our traditional art sector has achieved remarkable results. Today, it is a significant sector in our arts and cultural scene. The government is committed to support our traditional arts practitioners to lift the sector to the next level. Our Singapore society is entering a transition. Our social norms and values are changing. At this turning point, the strengthening of our local identity and cultural ballast becomes all the more crucial. In 2010, the government launched a 23 million National Traditional Arts Plan to support our traditional art forms. Senior Parliamentary Secretary Sam Tan will elaborate further on the progress of this plan and what else we are doing to preserve and promote our traditional arts.
Finally, on arts and heritage, the final point I'd like to make is that while the government will do more and will do its part, we should not rely solely on state financing for the arts and heritage. You can look at what other countries do, and in Europe, for example, funding for the arts tends to be state-controlled. But the experience there has not always been positive. Besides being subject to budget cuts whenever there's a fiscal tightening, too much bureaucracy can also stifle artistic development. Because the public officials will then have to decide what can or cannot be funded, and there will be tremendous frustration on the ground. Indeed, many in the arts community have shared with me that when it comes to the arts, they prefer that the government do less, not more, and open up the space for creative and artistic expressions. On the other hand, another model in the US, funding for the arts is overwhelmingly reliant on private patronage. It's not bad, but it also has its downsides, because art is not just a private enterprise. It's an essential element of our collective culture and identity. So what we need is a kind of partnership between the government, corporations, and individuals. And we must find the right balance between state support, private giving, and commercial activity. We have good examples of private giving to arts and heritage, like the donation by Mr. William Lim, which Mr. Arthur Fong highlighted earlier. But I agree with Mr. Arthur Fong that there's more that we can do to promote private giving to the arts. Over the last 5 years, while the number of arts organizations has increased, total private giving to the arts has remained more or less unchanged at only about 3% of all charitable donations. And compared to other countries, we still have some way to go. Because if you look on a per capita basis, giving to the cultural sector in Singapore stands at about $7 per person, compared to $13 in Australia, $14 in the UK, and $35 in the US. So we must do more to encourage cultural philanthropy, and that's why DPM Tharman had announced in his budget speech that the government will match private sector donations to arts and heritage groups, museums, and institutions. We will set aside $20 million in a cultural donation matching fund to finance these matching grants. We can only have a thriving arts and heritage sector if our people have a personal stake in Singapore's culture and feel the desire to contribute to its growth and development. Some members asked about the implementation details of the matching fund. Ms. Janice Koh asked for more flexible administration, I believe, earlier in the budget debate, and Mr. Ang Hin Kee suggested extending it to clan associations and art schools like NAFA, LaSalle, and also to cover building projects. We will look into all of these suggestions. We don't have details now, but for now what we have are some preliminary views on the principles in which the matching fund should work. One, we think it's better for the potential beneficiaries to be the ones doing the fundraising rather than a central agency, because this will enable the agency that's doing the fundraising to nurture donor relations. Two, we want the scheme to benefit a broad range of art institutions. And so there's a need to ensure that the matching grants are disbursed in a generally equitable manner and not monopolized by a few large beneficiaries. And three, we also want to ensure that the matching funds are used in a way that's impactful and sustainable and can support capability building in the cultural sector over the long term. Based on these broad principles, we will consult donors and potential beneficiaries to see how best to design the matching scheme. And so we will have a consultation paper that we'll put out for views, and we will firm up the details when the consultation is completed later this year. Madam Chair, I've outlined some of the plans to build a strong cultural core through the arts and heritage. Let me now turn to the other C, community, and the need to build more connections between our people. I think this is a point which several members have raised too, like Mr. Bayam K, Mr. David Ong, Mr. Lawrence Lian. We've all seen surveys of how Singapore has done well economically but lags behind in terms of happiness. And there are, of course, different ways to raise our happiness index. Hopefully, free museums will do so by some margin. But many studies show that the most important factor in happiness is the level of social connectedness in the community. It's not just in Singapore. Many studies around the world show this. How connected you are determines your level of happiness. Because when we are socially connected, good deeds are reciprocated and we help trust and rely on each other. And these relationships help us feel emotionally supported and they enrich our lives. Social ties across different communities are all the more important in Singapore because of our multiracial and multi-religious society. Over many years of patient effort, Singaporeans of all races and religions have learned to trust one another, to give and take, and to accommodate each other's different customs and ways of life. But as Mr. David Ong and Mr. Desmond Lee reminded us just now, we must never take this for granted. So I agree with them that more needs to be done to strengthen our community bonds, especially with new citizens and permanent residents in the mix. We are already looking at ways to do so. I chair the National Integration Council, or the NIC, and through the Council and its partners, we are helping our new citizens and PRs embrace our cultural core and adapt to our local norms and values. This will help them to interact meaningfully with Singaporeans, forge stronger bonds with our community, and contribute to nation building. At the same time, we should do more to foster interaction between Singaporeans of different races and religions. We cannot force this, but we must do our best to encourage it. And we have some ideas which SPS Sam Tam will share later in his speech. Singaporeans need to know one another, socialize together, and make friends with people who belong to different races and religions. And this is the way to widen our common ground and achieve unity in diversity. More importantly, community building like culture cannot be done by a single agency. It has to be embedded within the work of the entire government. It is about connecting people, nurturing relationships, and providing spaces and shared activities where people get to know one another. And as we do this well, collectively, we can build up a larger community, a nationwide community with a sense of belonging to Singapore. The good news is that we do see more Singaporeans actively involved in doing community projects. During the Singapore conversation, many participants said that they would like to see a more compassionate and inclusive society where the spirit of giving, volunteerism, and helping one another is a natural part of our lives. And to some extent, this is already happening. Every day, all over the island, acts of kindness are carried out by Singaporeans. They may not always be visible to the public eye, but they reflect the generous spirit of our people and our desire to make a difference in the lives of others. And over the past year, the survey done by the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Centre, NVPC, shows that 1 in 3 Singaporeans engage in volunteer acts. This is the highest rate of volunteerism since we started our survey, and it shows that we are moving on the right track. One example is 70-year-old Madam Tay Che Hyang. You see her in the picture here. She's the one in T-shirt, 70-year-old. Proves the point that the more you volunteer, the happier you are and the younger you can look. Despite recently undergoing several medical operations, Madam Tay is still a faithful volunteer with the Lions Befriender. Twice a week, she visits senior citizens who live alone to see if they need help, even going the extra mile by cooking meals for them. Some people volunteer in groups, and I hear of a group of over 70 mothers, 70 mothers living in the Henderson area. I don't have a picture of them, unfortunately, but they call themselves the Super Mummies. And these mothers come together to look after one another's children, support one another to overcome difficulties that parents face. And although it's difficult to coordinate the schedules of so many people, they have found a way to make it work. I've highlighted what some of elderly and parents do, but we also see positive trends in our younger generation. They are more active, more engaged, and prepared to do their part for the community. At a recent Singapore Conversation meeting, I was struck when a polytechnic student said, "Why must there always be a policy answer to all our problems?" And she added, "Let's unpolicy some policies." I learned a new word, unpolicy. And she was advocating that people solve problems by themselves, and I think that was very refreshing. Earlier this year, I had a conversation with university students, and the theme of their forum was More Than Ourselves, a generation that cares. So I think there's hope for us to move in this direction. We will encourage more of such civic activism. We will be happy to experiment with different models, as Mr. Lawrence Wong suggested, being bold in trying out different models, whether it's at the RCs or in community groups, or in providing seed funding for the community. But I would also say Mr. Lawrence Wong made a very important point that the government should step back and create space for genuine empowerment. Mr. Lien said that some public agencies are not so good at doing this, But I think it's not just about public agencies or public officers. Our public officers are committed and responsible, and they will do their jobs well. That's their duty and that's their responsibility. At the end of the day, it's about our social compact. It's about what the government does and public expectations of the government. And if we want to open space for more ground-up initiatives, I think all of us as leaders must be prepared to explain to our constituents and to our people that sometimes it's better for the government to do less and for solutions to emerge from the ground which are messier but more organic. And it's not always easy to do this, because if you listen to speeches made in this House over the past 2 weeks, I think I've only heard calls for the government to do more, not less. But nevertheless, as I described earlier, there are positive trends, and we should continue to move in this direction and identify areas where you can have less government and more bottom-up initiatives. This is how I believe we can nurture the kampong spirit and strengthen the sense that this is our home. While it is heartening that more Singaporeans are volunteering their time for good causes, there are also some new patterns emerging. For example, we've noticed that those who volunteer are contributing less time compared to previous years. More people are also volunteering on an occasional rather than a regular basis. From time to time, we've heard feedback from volunteers who are disappointed with their volunteering experience, and they decide not to continue serving after that. There are several reasons why this happens. Maybe the charities that they volunteer in are overwhelmed in serving the needs of the beneficiaries and so do not have capabilities to engage their volunteers well. But when non-profit organizations put in best practices for volunteer management, we've found that it really pays off. For example, in Dover Park Hospice, its investment in volunteers is a critical part of helping its patients live life to the fullest in their final days. As work in the hospice can be emotionally draining, its volunteers are given very thorough training in end-of-life care and provided with counseling support. And as a result, more than half of Dover Park Hospice's 260 active volunteers have stayed with the organization for 5 years or more. We hope to see more volunteers build long-term relationships with the charities that they are involved in and be engaged in ways that they find fulfilling and meaningful. Volunteers are more likely to stay on when they find joy and fulfillment in their volunteering experience. And to help our charities sustain volunteer involvement, MCCY will work with the NVPC to develop a volunteer management consultants initiative. So non-profit organizations will be able to tap on the services of a team of volunteer management consultants to build their volunteer management capabilities, such as designing programs for volunteers and helping volunteers contribute more effectively. Madam Chair, building a distinctive shared culture and an engaged community takes time. It's not something the government can mandate. It must be driven by the conviction of Singaporeans who care enough to do something to shape the character and tone of our society. And I'm optimistic that with the heartfelt calls for a stronger cultural core and a more engaged community, we can work together to build a home we are proud of.